I've been sort of earnestly working on this issue of internment now for about 30 plus years, and during that whole process, I've written a considerable amount on the subject of internment. I would characterize my writing as of three varieties. They happen to be both books and articles. There is the sort of the academic component. A lot of this has to do with kind of detailing the history of the experience, providing some kind of analysis where necessary, and in some respects also trying to make sense of the history of the experience generally, both enemy aliens and not just simply internment, so trying to contextualize it. I think the second type of literature that I embarked on is storytelling. And the storytelling aspect of it is because the internment sort of affected the lives of individuals, and more importantly, it destroyed lives. And in that, there's some merit of trying to communicate what had happened to these people at a personal, intimate level. And so I tried to do this in some of my writing as well. And then finally, there's a sort of a third type of writing that I've engaged in on this question. And it tends to be lessons learned. You know, how do we understand internment? What do we take away from it? And how do we move forward? So with that being said, I'd like to read selections, not from my recent book, No Free Man, but rather from some of my other work, lesser known work. And I'm going to read three selections that tend to typify the kind of things that I've been writing. So if I might, I'll read a selection briefly from Enemy Aliens, Prisoners of War, Internment Canada during the Great War. And in reading the selection, just as a preamble to it, I talk about sort of the work that was being done at the various national parks, Banff, Jasper, Yoho, and so on and so forth. And so having described what the internees did, this is the sort of selection that follows that description. Like the other work performed by the internees, this work was tremendously important. That's the work at these various mountain parks, and that it enabled the Park Service to maintain a significant level of activity at a critical time, the success of which was later leveraged in its bid to secure additional support and funding for further development. That the prisoners were civilian aliens of enemy nationalities was acknowledged, but their status did not appear to have bearing on their treatment. The irony of their deployment on a project that at the time was already being touted as having national significance was also not a factor. The key consideration was that internment labor was both profitable and useful. There was no greater evidence of this than at Banff and Castle Mountain, where the new and improved road perfectly graded impressed not only the visitors, whose traffic increased markedly as a result, but the officials in Ottawa as well when they came to inspect. So taken was the commissioner of the parks with the results of internment labor that he hoped that jail and penitentiary labor would be secured after the war for similar work in the parks. But perhaps the most telling indicator was the indelible impression that was left with a young soldier, John Anderson Wilson, who participated in the operation. Many years later, having witnessed firsthand the results of the internment labor, he still spoke of, quote, the marvels that had been accomplished by the internees, noting in his remarks the principle upon which the operation was based. Quote, anyone who asked of us to do anything, we provided the slaves, unquote. It was a perspicacious statement, but not necessarily because it was true. On the contrary, this description was clearly overdrawn. Rather, it captured a notion often associated with human conflict, an idea deeply embedded in the crusading spirit of war, that in war there are the victors and the vanquished, and to the former go the spoils. It is a proposition, however, that makes sense only if the defeated exist outside the body politic. But the problem, of course, was that the internees, by reason of their settlement, were very much a part of the country called Canada. So that selection really sort of speaks to this idea that these individuals were put to work on a national sort of project. And the irony, of course, was that they were being treated, in the words of Anderson Wilson, as slaves. Clearly an overdrawn description, but it still sort of spoke about the sentiment that underlined their internment, which is in effect that these were enemies and they would be put to work as seen fit. The difficulty with it was, of course, was that they were settler immigrants who had came to Canada and felt betrayed by what had occurred to them. The second selection, if I could, it comes from a work in the Shadow of the Rockies, Diary of Castle Mountain Internment Camp, and it's from an introduction. And I start off the diary by giving an account of internment, but I also try to sort of give an intimate sort of appreciation of what had occurred there by detailing three stories, three personal stories. And one of those stories has to do with John Condro, a young lad who was interned. And this selection describes sort of the impact of internment on the private lives of individuals. In early February 1916, Jacob Condro received a letter from his wife telling him that their son, John, had been arrested and imprisoned in an internment camp at Banff, Alberta. Upon receipt of this news, Jacob Condro did the only thing he could. He wrote an impassioned letter to the commander of the military district, Brigadier General Edward Cruikshank, pleading for the release of his son. He argued his case forcefully, pointing out that he was a naturalized Canadian citizen and that as such he did not, quote, think Canada would take their own people and put them in an internment camp, unquote. Jacob Condro concluded his letter to the general with a simple but heartfelt appeal. Please let him go. Upon receipt, General Cruikshank forwarded the letter to the officer commanding the Banff Castle Internment Station, Major Peter Spence, inquiring about the status of the prisoner. The major replied, quote, John Condro, son of Jacob, prisoner of war 224, is 17 years of age and has been in the country for 8 years living with his father. Although his father is a naturalized British subject, he himself has not taken out naturalization papers, unquote. The major clearly considered Condro to be in the main well-behaved and by all accounts a good worker. The boy's respect for authority suggested that he was sound, not suspicious character, and that if released, he would pose no danger. As to the lad's legal status, the major could only offer an opinion. It would appear to me if his father was naturalized before the boy became of age, he himself therefore becomes a British subject and would not be necessary for him to take out naturalization papers. Major Spence, without saying as much, was suggesting that a British subject was behind Canadian barbed wire. Major Spence's letter was sent to Internment Operations Headquarters in Ottawa for consideration. Arriving in late February, it passed from desk to desk. Duplicate copies were sent to other departments for comment. Months passed before a determination could be made. The decision, however, did not come soon enough for young Condro. One April morning, while working on the No. 1 Spray River Bridge Gang, Condro and 4 associates dashed into the bush and ran among the trees and through the dense underbrush, hoping all the while that a bullet would not find its mark. They made good their escape, all of them successfully eluding their captors. For John Condro, the mountains which had been his prison were now a sanctuary, once swallowed up by the great expanse. He would never be heard from again. Internment and the private trials endured by individuals, in effect, who had done no wrong. And then finally, sort of some of the writing that I undertaken as part of the discussion about lessons learned. And this comes from a little publication that I wrote some time ago in 1993, Writing Historical Wrongs, Internment, Acknowledgement, and Redress. And I talk about why it's important to remember. The utility in recognizing a historical wrong is in the meaning it shares with other potentially unjust events. That we condemn a historical injustice is to express a value which conditions our response to choices that we currently face. It also reinforces a tradition which allows us to avoid actions that would otherwise imperil our sense of identity and moral worth. We as a nation must pass moral judgment on historical injustices, because it is in this particular way of understanding the past that we become open to it and accept those very ideas and values we as a democratic people profess and use in shaping the justness of our own actions. But there are other imperatives that demand from us that we judge historical wrongs. Historical references enable us to speak intelligently about circumstances which may allow for real moral danger to manifest itself, and to recognize when the lives and dignity of a people are thus threatened. The consequences of actions are not always clear until a crime is committed. The lessons of history, as a result, have a real place in the current political dialogue in determining which actions are appropriate and what principles must be upheld. These are some of the writings that I've conducted over the many years, the central thrust of which, of course, is how did this happen? Why did it happen? And what have we learned?